On Mondays in Mo, we're going to be taking a look at the janky, wacky, but wonderfully weird Binary Domain, which released in 2012 and was developed by too many developers to name, but also designed by Toshihiro Nagoshi, someone who has had a huge role in the development and the design of Yakuza for pretty much forever. I think he's still working on it. He worked on the 2016 release. I'm not sure if he worked on the last couple games, but nonetheless, he's been influential in the history of Yakuza, and he had a huge part in the creation of Binary Domain. Now, this game originally released on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows PC. You can play it on Steam. It's $14.99. You can pick up a copy on the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3 for less than $10. And honestly, if you own either of those consoles, I recommend you play it there because the PC version, even though Steam gives it a 9 out of 10 user review rating, is a terrible, terrible port. It is really hard to get it set up. It's janky. It doesn't run that well all of the time, even though it's a really old and outdated game. And even worse, if you want to make any changes whatsoever to graphical settings, audio settings, key bindings, you have to exit the game and boot up a separate configuration menu to do so. It's not pretty. If you are going to play it on PC, bring some patience and plug in a controller because the mouse and keyboard, not that fun to play with. That all said, let's move forward and talk about just what Binary Domain is. Now, 2012, Gears of War, still rocking and rolling, doing its thing, pretty popular as a third-person cover-based shooter. More importantly, though, Gears of War would sort of redefine what it meant to be a third-person shooter in that it would essentially be a first-person shooter where you could see the character. The idea that as your reticle, your right stick is always attached to the player's gun. Now, a lot of other third-person cover shooters may have spawned after the success of Gears of War, but few of them actually played out the same way as Gears of War did. Few of them were actually that first-person game where you could just so happen to see your character. You know, Uncharted, for example, is more third-person with shooting mechanics than Gears of War ever was. Binary Domain fits more in line with Gears of War in that it feels a lot more like a first-person shooter where you can see your character. The controls and the aiming are more direct, and you can't necessarily rotate the stick around and watch your character run backwards in a different direction like you could in Uncharted. Now that's really just a small piece of the puzzle for Binary Domain. Yes, it's a cover-based, third-person shooter that plays a little bit like Gears of War. That's really where the comparisons to Gears of War end, and that's where Binary Domain starts to get a whole lot more weird, wonderful, and unique, because this is a game that takes place in Tokyo, Japan in the year 2080. It's full of characters from all walks of life, including the two main characters, Dan and Big Boy, who are from the United States, ex-Special Forces. There's some people from the SAS. You've got a Chinese unit. The game's all over the place when it comes to its character representation, which is really cool because you get a bunch of different personalities from a bunch of different cultures all thrown into the fray, the greater story arc that is in Binary Domain, which comes across as sort of Terminator meets Blade Runner meets a hell of a lot of other sci-fi films you've probably seen 1,000 times over. I personally love the representation of the United States here in the game story as well. The United States government specifically is like cliche, but also not so cliche and actually very real based on some things that have happened in United States history. And I just think the whole thing just comes across as very campy, very wonderful, and very fun, while also trying to be really, really serious. Now, there's a hell of a lot of things that are delivered through the game's story through cutscenes, including smaller cutscenes with your characters, characters of your squad, so on and so forth. The game is going to build out a lot of its story and a lot of its characters' personalities through those sorts of cutscenes. However, a lot more happens under the control of you as the player, and here is one of Binary Domain's little broken gems. This is why I love Japanese developers. They make games like Dragon's Dogma and Binary Domain that introduce new concepts and ideas for how the player can interact with the game world, whether it be through gameplay or through storytelling, that maybe don't 100% work, but you know what? They still kind of work most of the time, and the end result is something that might be janky and broken, but is purely wonderful. This is something that AAA publishers, whether it be in the East or in the West, typically don't let their developers do, which is why we get a lot of games that are the same as they were the year before with little innovation, with little risk. Binary Domain is not that game, and one of its primary mechanics is to allow the player to interact with the members of their squad. It has a very Mass Effect thing going on, except of much lower quality when it comes to the writing. But that's not really where it gets special. Building a relationship with a character in Mass Effect is a very powerful, sometimes emotional, and sometimes even romantic thing, right? That's what makes BioWare so good at storytelling, so good at character development. Binary Domain looks to do the same thing, but through much simpler means that work a little bit more on the end result, what the player gets after they say something, than what the player is actually allowed to say. So there are two ways in which you can actually communicate with your squad in this game. You can, one, use a sort of chat wheel that has some options, some dialogue selections you can make when a character asks you something, or just in the middle of combat when you feel like saying something to your fire team. The more interesting way of doing this is to actually talk through your microphone. So a couple other games in the past have tried to do microphone controls or microphone communication. Binary Domain just does it with a few keywords, if you will. So say I'm in combat, it's me, Dan, and Big Boy over here, and I want Big Boy to charge the enemy. I can simply say, charge, and he'll get up and run at the enemy, and really, he'll do that thinking I'm going to follow him. He's thinking, okay, well, if Dan said charge, we're going to charge. So if I stay back and I decide not to charge and send him into the fray alone, after that engagement's over, he's going to be kind of upset with me. And he might even walk up to me and say something like, hey, what the hell was that all about, Dan? You just left me behind? You just left me hanging? You wimped out like that? Is that how things are going to be? It's the weirdest thing that can ever happen in a game to a player. Making a decision and then having the AI turn around in just a kind of janky and half-implemented way and say to you, dude, what the fuck? You just gonna wimp out like that, bro? Had it actually been implemented well and like crafted into a cutscene or a dialogue tree like it is in Mass Effect, I don't think it would actually have the same sort of weight and value it has here. It's the idea that it happens so rough, so organically, that I think makes it have a larger impact, if that makes any sense. It's the strangest thing, dude. But that's the entire game, right? I can just respond to AI interactions. I can make interactions with the AI. I can call them idiots. I can disagree with them. And that's going to allow me to develop a relationship, whether it be positive or negative, with the many characters that will start to make up your squad as you progress through Binary Domain. And there's actually a lot of interesting characters in Binary Domain. You know, there's the initial squad that you hook up with, but things get a lot weirder as time goes on, including a French robot who you can befriend or decide not to befriend. It's all really weird and, again, really quite wonderful. It all works the majority of the time. It's kind of like getting on a roller coaster, and the engineers are sort of building out new and interesting parts to the roller coaster as you're riding it. Sometimes you get there and they finished it and you make it through and you get to the other side of that loop. Sometimes they implement something that doesn't really work that well, but you make it through anyway. It was a rough ride, but it was a hell of a lot of fun. And sometimes it's like the track just isn't there at all, and you crash into a wall, and you listen to some really cringe dialogue, and Dan and Big Boy make themselves look like complete idiots. But you know what? You hit the ground, you somehow survive, you brush it all off, you laugh, and you get back on for another ride. That's pretty much Binary Domain. Now, the one area in which this game hits home 24/7 from start to finish is its gameplay. So while the third-person gunplay isn't that spectacular, the fighting of giant mechs absolutely is. The small robots, they're cannon fodder. They've got a few variations, some guys with shields, some guys that charge you with like energy boosters. But when you fight the big robots like the Grand Lancer and the Spider Tank, that's when stuff gets really cool. And that's where you can start to see a lot of the connections, the references that people make to this game and Vanquish. Giant robots with some pretty interesting and complex combat mechanics. The idea here is that these robots, as they show up and fight you again and again, sometimes of the same style, will bring a different defense mechanism or a different offensive mechanism. The idea that you have to learn a new way to defeat them the second time you fight them or the third time you fight them. And throughout this, you're going to be using things like the environment, you're going to be communicating with your team, you might be jumping on top of this robot to kill it. You basically have these boss fights that feel super organic, super diverse, and as if they should be in an open world game like Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, but they're pumped into this linear experience. And it's a really beautiful thing. It makes the gameplay a lot of fun. Throw in a lot of just really cool set pieces, whether it be sliding down the side of a dam and dodging pipes and vents while shooting at things, and you've got a really, really fun game. I understand completely why the few people who have reviewed it, the 1,448 people who have reviewed it actually over on Steam, have decided that overall as an average, the game's a 9 out of 10. because it's a fun little cult classic. It's right up there with like Spec Ops for me. It's not perfect by any means. It has a lot of flaws, but the end game, once you've finished it, is a really fun ride. And it does, again, a lot of things that I think traditional AAA developers don't get to do. They're just not willing to take these risks. They're not willing to try out these weird and janky things because it doesn't fit with what's popular, with what works already. Binary Domain is sort of the anti-AAA game in that it just does what it wants to do, and sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't. The end result, though, once again, is something kind of beautiful, kind of janky, and altogether really quite wonderful. I cannot recommend it enough, especially considering the price point. If you like third-person cover-based shooters, if you like games that allow you to sort of develop relationships with personalities and characters and have your own little waifus, Binary Domain is all of that and a little bit more, but I'll leave the rest of it as a surprise. Check it out. If you decide to, feel free to come back here and let me know what you thought of it. And of course, if you've already played Binary Domain, what do you love about it or what do you hate about it? Let me know down in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one.